So let's talk about the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, who is now running for president, Pete Buttigieg. Now, I pretty much from the start just wrote him off when he announced that he was running for president in 2020, because back in 2017, when he was running to be the DNC chair, I was thoroughly unimpressed by him because he just seemed as if he was just another establishment figure who is willing to play patty cake with the establishment. He really tried to downplay the really important civil war that's going on within the Democratic Party and is still going on. He would refuse to unequivocally state whether or not the DNC rigged the primary against Bernie Sanders in 2016, and he just seemed pretty milquetoast for the most part. And I still believe that a lot of that is largely true, to be honest. But nonetheless, he's running for president, and it seems as if he's starting to pick up steam. I wouldn't necessarily say that he has a lot of grassroots support because just, so far, I don't see that yet. But he's saying a lot of things that are honestly impressive to me. So, for example, he was on Morning Joe, and he was talking about healthcare. Now, throughout the course of this interview, they were trying to press him and get him to put himself in either the progressive or establishment camp, and he wouldn't take the bait. Now, fence sitting on this issue, it irritates me because you're either with progressives or you're an establishment figure. You can't really play both sides, and I think that that's what he wants to do, but at his core, he seems to be more progressive and left-leaning, although we don't know everything about his record and whatnot. But he was talking about healthcare as they were trying to press him on these issues, saying, well, you clearly are more progressive because you support the Green New Deal and Medicare for all. But what he says about healthcare specifically, it really did impress me because he's saying things that are really unorthodox, things that you wouldn't necessarily hear if you turned on the mainstream media, and especially Morning Joe. Take a look.
And you're for the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal. You're for Medicare for all with a few asterisks.
Yeah.
You see this tension between democracy and capitalism, which some of us don't see, or at least see that it can work out. It sounds like you're going to get defined pretty far over on the progressive spectrum.
Look, I think what we have to decide is, are we going to keep being defined by where these fence posts are, or are we going to do what the right very successfully did over the last 40 years and redefine them? Medicare for all is a great example. Again, ACA, which was a conservative proposal, came to be caricatured as left-wing by a very disciplined right-wing message machine, right? What is Medicare for all? It's a compromise. I mean, in the UK, you got national health care. That would be the left-wing, the true left-wing position. The true right-wing position is free for all corporate. And the compromise position is a single-payer system where you have private doctors but a public payer. We've got to stop allowing the right to move the goalposts and characterize the entire center of the debate.
Respectfully, it's not the right that's moving at the moment. It's the Democrats. The Democrats are looking at all. We have 15 candidates who are trying to figure out.
Yeah.
And so naturally, it's not surprising, and I don't think it's wrong that we try to figure out where people line up on all these important issues.
Well, absolutely.
And you seem to line up closer to the left side of the page than the right side of the page within the Democratic Party. That's all.
That was actually fantastic. He was pretty much 99% correct there. And he said things about socialism in other interviews that also were very accurate. He says that, socialism nowadays, it's not as problematic as it used to be when it was really this big buzzword, because now it's lost all meaning. Because look at what the Republican Party did to the Affordable Care Act. This was a right-wing healthcare proposal that was caricatured as this left-wing socialist thing, and they kind of played all of their cards too early, and now it's coming back to bite them in the ass, the Republican Party, that is, specifically. So when he talks about Medicare for all being a compromise between a national health system and a for-profit system, that's exactly it, and we need someone to say this in mainstream media because they need to actually correct the record. Not to invoke that super PAC with David Brock, but to actually correct the record in terms of setting people straight, setting the pundit class straight and saying, look, it's not that Democrats are moving back to the left, but it's that we're trying to correct the Overton window and moderate both parties so that way they're more aligned with the median American who supports increasing the minimum wage, who supports legalizing recreational marijuana, who supports Medicare for all, a federal jobs guarantee, Green New Deal, who supports all of these things. So it's not radical if the average American supports things like Medicare for all. And that's exactly what they needed to hear. And of all people, I didn't expect Pete to say that. Now, additionally, he went into a little bit more detail about the right-wing Overton window, and everything he explained here, 100% accurate.
But there's also the bigger project of making sure that the center of gravity of American politics is actually lined up with the center of gravity of the American people. I mean, today, on the anniversary of the Parkland shooting, for example, you got something like universal background checks that command support from 80, maybe 90% of the American people, something that most Republicans, most gun owners are on board with. And yet, if you looked in Congress, you would think that was a left-wing position.
Right.
So, you know, we've got to acknowledge that the right did a masterful job over the last 40 years of being willing, even if it meant losing in the short term, to pull the entire center of gravity of the American political spectrum further right than where most American people already are. Most Americans get that everybody ought to have health care. Most Americans get that wages are too low, and we got to do something about that. And I don't think it's a crazy left-wing idea that we ought to have a sense of urgency, a sense of emergency even, as somebody who's thinking about what the world's going to look like in 2054 when I get to the current age of the current president, that we got to do something about climate change that acknowledges it as an emergency that really is, in its destructive power, on par with something like the Great Depression or World War II. So, of course, we got to have something on the scale of a Green New Deal. That's not left-wingism, that's pragmatism.
So that was important for two reasons. First of all, it's important because nobody in mainstream media ever talks about the Overton window. Now, he didn't say the words Overton window, but that's basically what he was alluding to. He was saying, look, the Overton window in this country has essentially shifted so far to the right that what is the moderate left position now seems radical because of the perspective that we've all construed in our minds. But in actuality, people aren't far leftists if they support things like Medicare for all or the Green New Deal. This is the practical approach. And that was the second reason why this was important. What he said was important because he's redefining what pragmatism means, because we've been kind of taught that pragmatism in the Washington, D.C. sense means that you just simply meet Republicans halfway and compromise with them. But what he's saying is, no, what being pragmatic means in actuality is taking the left-wing position. So he actually has gone up in my book after hearing him. At this point, you know, with my rankings, Bernie Sanders is a strong number one. And then when it comes to number two, I'm still conflicted on Elizabeth Warren and Tulsi Gabbard. You know, I start to lean one way or the other and then change my mind. So I was leaning a little bit towards Elizabeth Warren, admittedly. And then she stood up and cheered for Donald Trump when he said that we'll never be a socialist country. That pissed me off. She went back down. So I'm still conflicted, right? I'm conflicted between Tulsi and Warren for number two. But when it comes to my fourth slot, now I'm conflicted between Andrew Yang and Pete Buttigieg here. I'm gonna fuck up his name a lot, but you know, we'll roll with it. I'm conflicted between them because Andrew Yang, ideally speaking, is better than Pete Buttigieg because he's anti-establishment. He supports universal basic income, but as far as I know, he doesn't support free college, and also he has these right-wing tendencies that I don't like. For example, Kyle Kalinske brought up how he is in support of policy where he automatically has a sunset clause for all regulations. Yeah, I vehemently disagree with that. I am wholeheartedly against that. So now, since Pete Buttigieg has gone up in my mind, we kind of see him competing with Andrew Yang for number 4. So we have Bernie at number 1, tied for, 2 and 3 is Elizabeth Warren and Tulsi Gabbard, and now for 4 and 5, it's a tie between Andrew Yang and Pete Buttigieg. He's supporting the right policies. He's talking about things that you wouldn't necessarily hear a DC politician talk about, and maybe that's because he does have that outsider perspective. He's a mayor. He's not in that DC bubble, so not being entrenched, it really does make a difference. Not being entrenched in DC orthodoxy, you can see the impact it has on him. He's a lot more clear-headed when it comes to just explaining things that is obvious, but not to someone in that elitist bubble. Now, just for shits and giggles, I'm going to play a clip of Claire McCaskill, who, as you all know, was hired by Morning Joe, and the questions she chose to ask. Keep in mind, there are seemingly infinite numbers of things you can ask candidates about. This is what she chose to ask them about.
How many languages do you speak? You are someone who clearly has been interested in learning more and being intellectually curious. And how important do you think that is for a president of the United States?
Oh, Claire McCaskill, always bringing the substance, asking the questions nobody cares about. Brilliant.
Girly Mike Fettuccine needs your support on Patreon. What a loser. Visit patreon.com/Humanist Report to support the low ratings Humanist Report. Sad. My views are much higher.